Alright, so now that we've assembled the X and Y axes, we have to do the Z axis. We have to align the pieces, match drill them, and then assemble them with the rods. One of the ways that we're going to hold these pieces together, so we have these two bottom pieces which support the spindle, and then we have the top piece which supports the Delrin lead screw nut, and then the rods go between them in an orientation like this. We're actually going to use the spindle bushing. It's a larger bushing. We're going to use that to help hold these together in the proper orientation for drilling. And in order to be able to clamp these together, notice this, I've already marked these two pilot holes here. Although it's finally going to go in an orientation like this, that is extraordinarily hard to align and clamp. So what we're actually going to do is flip this over and clamp them together like that, and then match drill the two holes through there like that. So we're going to clamp together like this, go over to the drill press, and do our 3/8 inch match drilling through all three pieces at the same time. Before you do any of the match drilling, it's actually important, especially if your drill press has any kind of adjustable bed, to make sure that it really is drilling what are called normal holes. That means they're completely perpendicular in both axes. So the easiest way to do that is just to get a little square or like a little framing triangle or something, and just put it on the bed and bring the drill bit down, a nice fat drill bit, and check it in one direction, and yes, that's actually square in that direction, and then go at right angles and check it again, and it's square in that direction also. So now you know that it is truly at 90 degrees to the bed, so that your holes are not going to be coming into your pieces at an angle, which of course would throw them off. Another way is to use something like a digital angle gauge, where you'd set the bed and check that 0 degrees, and then when you check the side of the bit, it should be 90 degrees, again in two directions, and then you know again that your holes are going to be normal. Alright, so I've got this clamped into position on the drill press. Now there's a few things to remind you about. Remember, you can use your hands and eyes to make sure that these edges are all aligned properly. And this drill press, of course, has a laser sight on it, but you still need to use the bevel of the bit visually, that direction and that direction. Make sure you're coming right down on either your pilot hole or the mark that you've made. And lastly, remember, you're going through 3 layers now. So I took that tape I had, which is my depth indicator, to make sure I don't blow all the way through the waste piece, and I've moved it up to account for the fact that I'm going through 3 layers of wood instead of just 2, as I did in all my other drilling. So this is going to be the first of the matched pair of holes. Alright, so got my safety glasses on, and also as another reminder, remember, as you're doing the alignment, you have your bed clamped after you've made sure that the hole is normal. You can use even the light end of the hammer to very gently tap this back and forth and get your alignment perfect before you clamp this thing down tight, and then test it again, and then once you got it right, then you can do your actual drilling. So what we're going to do, you've already seen this twice, is I'm going to take that tool I had, that piece of 3/8 inch shoulder bolt, and I'm going to knock it through all 3 of these holes, and then of course I'll just turn it around and I'll match drill the other set of holes. And then I'll have the rod holes made. So these are the three pieces that we match drilled last time. And they're going to be put together in this orientation with the 7-inch rods, like so. But the first thing you got to do is, before we were just using the spindle bushing, the big bushing, as a pin to hold these pieces in alignment while we drilled them. Now we actually have to epoxy them in together. And this piece is going to be the top. You want the piece where you've marked or drilled the 3 holes for the motor pins. You want that to be on top. And so we're going to just separate them like this. Remember, you don't want to lose your orientation. I'm going to put this piece in there and epoxy it in place, and then put this piece on top. Now, as unlike in the other epoxying that we have done before, you can't use 5-minute epoxy for this because there's too many pieces that we have to assemble, and it would harden up too fast. So again, we're going to put this piece in there, and then we're going to put this piece on top. And we'll put a very, very little bit on the actual inside of the hole. You really don't want a lot, because then when you go to put the bushing in, if there's too much in there, it's just going to bulldoze it off the edges, and it might pile up inside, and then you have to scrape it off the bushing on the inside before you can add your bearings. And so most of the epoxy we're actually going to put on the outside of the lower portion of this bushing, and then push that into the wood so that it won't get up around the mouth of the bushing and we have to clean it out. Okay, so we're going to put that in here, and we might have to get the mallet and just tap that in very gently. Okay. Same token, when we're putting the top piece back on here, we want to put just a very little bit on the inside of the hole, and most of it's going to go on the outside of the bushing, and then push this down, tap it if you have to, and we want to make sure that it's flush on both sides. And if there's any excess, just wipe that off on both sides. And now that, of course, is not set up yet, so now we're going to be able to put the rods in there and make sure that the rod holes will be aligned by the rods going in. For that, I'm going to need a little more epoxy. So I'm just putting some epoxy down in the holes here. And remember, these 3 holes here for the motor pins need to be on the top. Oops. And a little epoxy on the rod, not a big deal. I'm going to align that and tap. Go through till it's flush. I should actually probably put this on a card because I'm going to make a mess when the epoxy pushes out the other end. And there it is, almost. Almost. And that one's flush. And I already put epoxy in the other hole, so now I just put a little epoxy on the end of this rod. And same thing, just going to tap it through this hole. All right, so those are epoxied in place. And you want to get yourself a napkin or something and make sure that if you've gotten any little bit of smears on the rod, that you can just wipe those off. You can also wipe off the excess that's squirted out the bottom just a bit. And any excess on the bottom. This is a fairly sticky variety of epoxy. And get the clean portion. And make sure that your rods are nice and clean. There's no epoxy on them. Okay. Now we're going to get ourselves some tape. I'm just going to put a little circle of tape around each rod to contain the bushings, so that the bushings do not slide down and get into trouble with any epoxy down here at the bottom. So Scotch tape, electrical tape, doesn't matter. Alright, so now that I've done that, I'm going to get my 4 more of the bushings. So 4 more of the bushings, and of course 2 on each rod. And just to make sure they don't get into trouble, let's just keep them in the middle by putting another piece of tape over top of them. Just like so. And now that I've done that, I'm going to get myself another pair of gloves, and I will be epoxying and very carefully tapping this piece of wood on in that orientation. Alright, so I got myself a new set of gloves, and I'm going to put just a little bit in the hole here. And just a little bit on the rods. All right. And of course, as I said, they're going to go together in a Z formation like so. So get those lined up, and they should just be pretty much lined up already since you match drilled them. And then we're just going to tap that down symmetrically, just like you did with the x-axis and with the y-axis. And as we're starting to get up to the top here, we just want to clean that off. The unfortunate part about this brand of epoxy, although it's extremely strong, it's great stuff, is it is gray, and it does make things look a little bit grubby. And get the sides tapped down the same amount. That looks great. We want to clean off any excess right up here at the top of the rod. All right, so we have this done, and now get another paper towel. Now I've done that, let's just make sure there's nothing else to clean off here. This is all pretty well cleaned. And now we need to align this. And to align it, we're going to use this small piece, which eventually, of course, is going to be screwed into this. But for now, what we're going to do is hang this off the edge. I'm going to space out these rods a little, these bushings a little bit. Actually, to do this, I'm going to take the tape off now that I'm done with my epoxy. So we want to be able to get the maximum spread on these for the most accuracy we can get. And we want to just lay this down there like so on the edge of your table. And you want to push this down and then visually check it. And what you're doing is using this piece of wood to ensure that these rods are actually parallel, so that these two pieces have not become rotated in relation to each other. If that happens, of course, then your rods, instead of being parallel, are actually going to be what's called skew. And then, of course, this piece will never run true on those bushings. And so the easiest way to do this is after you've pressed it down, look at it, and the only way it can be right is if it doesn't rock and there's no light. I see light right here under this one, and it also rocks just a hair, which means that one's wrong. So I've got to twist, counter twist this just a bit to push that one down. And that bit of light has decreased, but there's still just a little. So again, I'm forcing it down on those to make sure that it's almost gone. One more hair. So now I see no light under any of these four bushings, and it no longer wobbles when I tap any corner of it. So that is now aligned. These rods are now parallel and they're not skew. So later on when we epoxy this piece on, which we're not going to do right now because we have to let this set up, those will run true. So now I'm going to leave this here and to set up, and I'll of course put warning signs all over it, making sure that people don't come and tamper with it while it sets up. And this is going to take about 24 hours to completely set up. So now that this is set up, we are going to be epoxying it onto this smaller Z-axis plate here, which eventually, of course, is going to mate with the larger one back here by means of these three screws. Now I want to reiterate that as they come from your supplier, these oil-like bushings are a little on the greasy side. And you can see that if you look at the piece of wood that I left them sitting on last time. They weren't glued on, but you notice how they just kind of got pretty nasty looking, left oil stains on the wood. So we're going to clean these off with acetone to make sure that we get any, at least, the most of it off, so that it will bond better. And of course we're going to glue it onto the other side of the wood. So you can just use a little acetone or lighter fluid or denatured alcohol, just some sort of solvent to clean off these bushings of hair. And to make it easier to properly space and align these bushings visually, I've taken a ruler and I've measured off about a 1/4 inch stripe on each side and just drawn a line. And that's just to give me a little bit of a visual indicator. You can't really ensure that it's square and not angled like this. You can't do it by butting it up against this end, because you tapped these in just by eye. And so in fact this upper plate may not be exactly at 90 degrees to the rod. So you don't want to just butt it up and assume that that's square. We're going to use these lines as visual indicators. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, but it's nice if you can have it, centered left to right and also not at an angle. It's going to go in this orientation, this being the upper plate and these being the lower ones. And so this is also upper. So what that means is the 2 holes are going to go towards the single plate. So now that these have been acetone, of course acetone dries instantly, so that's out of the way. You want to line this up, and the Z plate, the upper plate, is going to hang off the edge of your table, and we're going to slide. You notice none of these really bind more than the others because we use this plate to set those rods evenly so there's no twist in them. So they're still, if you feel, there's no rocking back and forth because these rods are in fact parallel and not skew, because we did that last time. So you want to get them excuse me, almost up to the top, not quite, it doesn't need to be all the way up. I'm going to center them left and right using those 2 pencil lines I made, and we want to center them so they're not rotated, so they're parallel to the long sides of this piece. And with good lighting I can see that those lines just bring it a lot closer to the rods, and so it's a lot easier to visually see how it is aligned. And then of course I have the epoxy, and as you've seen several other times, I'm just going to mix up the epoxy and very carefully put epoxy on each side of these bushings, and of course avoid getting any on the rods themselves. So I'm just going to put this epoxy in the crack here underneath these bushings, and there, on the inside and outside corners. And probably while it's here, and of course you're going to double check your alignment, it also wouldn't hurt to just take each bushing, lift up just a hair, kind of wiggle it back and forth a little bit. You're just kind of rolling some epoxy right all the way down into the crack. You want this to be a really good bond, since this is going to have quite a bit of pressure on it when it's actually milling. So you want to have the epoxy kind of rolled under there a little bit, and rolled under each corner. And now that that's set, again I'm going to use my visual indicators, the lines I made, to make sure that I'm still square and that I'm still evenly spaced right to left. And again, before you leave this to dry or to leave this to cure, the 2 holes are on the side with the single plate. That's the top, 2 holes, 1 plate. And we're all set. And if you think you've gotten even a little bit of epoxy on the rod, that's more of a stain than anything. So you want to take a little acetone and wipe it off. And that looks fine.